November 15th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The basement of the Navy's administration building, officially designated Station Hypo, unofficially known as the Dungeon, where fluorescent lights hummed constantly in windowless rooms that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink, and the peculiar metallic odor of electronic equipment running continuously without adequate ventilation, where Commander Joseph John Rochefort sat at a desk covered with intercepts of Japanese naval radio traffic, messages encrypted in codes that Station Hypo had been systematically breaking for 18 months. Messages that, when properly analyzed, revealed patterns suggesting something catastrophic was developing in the Pacific, something that Rochefort's analytical mind recognized as the preparation phase for a major offensive operation, something that every instinct told him would target American forces in Hawaii, despite the consensus opinion among senior naval officers that Japan would strike south toward the Philippines or Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, because those targets offered strategic resources that Japan desperately needed, while Hawaii offered nothing except symbolic value and tactical difficulty. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. Rochefort was 41 years old, a career intelligence officer who had learned Japanese during attaché duty in Tokyo during the 1920s, who understood not just the language, but the cultural patterns that shaped Japanese military thinking, who had spent 2 decades studying naval communications and cryptographic systems, with an obsessive focus that made him perhaps the most knowledgeable officer in the Pacific Fleet concerning Japanese naval capabilities and intentions. His basement operation at Station Hypo employed approximately 120 personnel, mostly young enlisted men trained in mathematics and linguistics, working 3 shifts around the clock, intercepting Japanese radio transmissions, recording the encrypted messages, applying cryptanalytic techniques to break the codes, translating the decrypted text from Japanese to English, analyzing the content for strategic intelligence, and producing daily summaries that were supposed to inform Pacific Fleet Command decisions, but which increasingly seemed to be ignored or dismissed when their conclusions conflicted with pre-existing assumptions about Japanese behavior. The pattern Rochefort had identified in the intercepted traffic was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood how naval operations were coordinated, how fleet movements were communicated, how administrative logistics preceded combat action. Starting in late October 1941, Japanese naval radio traffic had increased dramatically in volume while simultaneously becoming more fragmented in content, with messages referencing unit designations and movement schedules and supply requirements without specifying destinations or operational objectives, classic indicators of fleet concentration in preparation for major action. The traffic analysis showed that multiple Japanese carrier divisions had gone radio silent after transmitting final administrative messages, suggesting they were maintaining communications security during movement to assembly areas, suggesting operational preparation at the highest readiness levels. Most significantly, the pattern of radio silence and message redirection suggested that Japanese carriers were not heading south toward Southeast Asia, as conventional wisdom predicted, but were instead moving east across the Pacific, maintaining strict communications discipline that made precise tracking impossible, but which created negative space in the radio intercept logs, gaps in expected transmission patterns that indicated the carriers were operating in areas where American monitoring stations couldn't detect their signals, areas that geometry and radio propagation physics suggested were in the central or northern Pacific, areas from which Hawaii could be reached by carrier strike forces operating at maximum stealth. Rochefort had compiled this analysis into a 23-page report completed on November 15, 1941, a report that stated in careful bureaucratic language what he believed with absolute certainty, that Japan was preparing to attack Pearl Harbor within the next 3 to 4 weeks, that the attack would be launched by carrier-based aircraft striking without warning, that the objective would be to destroy the Pacific Fleet at anchor before war was formally declared, that the tactical surprise would be complete because American commanders were focused on defending the Philippines and Southeast Asia, while assuming Hawaii was too distant and too well defended to be a practical target for Japanese offensive operations. The report's conclusion was stark. Analysis of Japanese naval communications patterns indicates preparation for major offensive operations in the Pacific theater. Traffic analysis suggests carrier forces have departed home waters and are moving under communications silence toward operational areas. Geographic analysis of signal gaps indicates probable target is U.S. Pacific Fleet anchorage at Pearl Harbor. Estimated time frame for attack is late November to early December 1941. Recommend immediate implementation of maximum defensive posture, including dispersal of fleet units, increased aerial reconnaissance, and preparation for coordinated Japanese assault on multiple Pacific bases simultaneously. Rochefort submitted this report through proper channels on November 16, 1941, sending copies to Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, to Admiral Claude Bloch, Commandant of the 14th Naval District, to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, and to the War Plans Division that was responsible for strategic assessments. He included supporting documentation showing the intercepted messages, the cryptanalytic methodology used to break the codes, the traffic analysis that revealed the carrier movement patterns, the geographic calculations that eliminated other potential targets and pointed unmistakably toward Hawaii as the objective. The response came within 48 hours, not in the form of urgent defensive preparations, but in the form of a memorandum from Admiral Kimmel's staff dismissing Rochefort's analysis as speculative interpretation unsupported by concrete intelligence, as alarmist assessment based on ambiguous signals, as the work of a junior officer who lacked the strategic perspective to properly evaluate Japanese intentions and capabilities. The memorandum, signed by Captain Charles McMorris, Kimmel's War Plans officer, stated, "Commander Rochefort's analysis relies excessively on negative evidence, the absence of radio signals, rather than positive intelligence indicating Japanese intentions. The interpretation that radio silence indicates carrier movement toward Hawaii is one possible explanation among many. More probable explanations include routine training exercises, maintenance periods requiring communications restrictions, or deliberate deception intended to mask actual operations elsewhere. The assessment that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor is strategically illogical, given that such an attack would accomplish little while risking Japan's carrier forces against a defended target. Japan's rational course of action is to secure resource areas in Southeast Asia, not to conduct symbolic attacks against American bases that have no strategic value beyond psychological impact. The dismissal was absolute, the certainty was complete, and the condescension was barely concealed beneath the formal language of military staff work. Rochefort read the memorandum in his basement office and felt his chest constrict with the realization that his warning would be ignored, that the Pacific Fleet would remain concentrated in Pearl Harbor with minimal defensive preparations, that when the attack came, and he knew with absolute certainty that it was coming, the casualties would be catastrophic because ships at anchor with crews on weekend liberty and aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip for sabotage protection would be defenseless against coordinated air assault. He tried again on November 22nd, sending a supplemental report that included additional intercepts showing Japanese diplomatic traffic instructing their embassy in Washington to destroy code machines and burn documents, classic indicators of imminent military action, indicators that should have been interpreted as final warning that war was about to begin. The supplemental report stated, Japanese diplomatic traffic indicates preparation for cessation of negotiations. Embassy instructed to destroy cryptographic materials on or before November 30th. This timeline correlates with previous assessment of late November military action. Recommend immediate defensive measures and dispersal of fleet units to prevent concentration of targets in Pearl Harbor. This second report generated no formal response at all, as if Rochefort's warnings had become background noise that senior officers had learned to ignore, as if the young commander's analytical expertise was less valuable than the strategic judgment of admirals who had decades of experience and who certainly understood Japanese capabilities better than some basement-dwelling cryptanalyst whose entire worldview was filtered through intercepted radio messages rather than based on real operational experience commanding fleets and planning campaigns. On November 27th, Admiral Kimmel received a war warning message from Washington stating that negotiations with Japan had failed and that aggressive Japanese action was expected within days, but the message specifically stated that the number and equipment of Japanese troops and the organization of naval task forces indicate an amphibious expedition against either the Philippines, Tai, or Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo, making no mention of Hawaii, reinforcing the assumption that the threat was directed south rather than east, that Pearl Harbor was safe because it was distant and well-defended and strategically marginal compared to the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. Rochefort, reading this war warning message, understood that Washington's assessment was based on the same flawed assumptions that had caused Admiral Kimmel's staff to dismiss his analysis. Assumptions that rational actors only attack targets with obvious strategic value. Assumptions that distance provides protection. Assumptions that well-defended bases are immune to surprise attack. Assumptions that had been proven wrong throughout military history, but which senior officers continued believing because the alternative was too uncomfortable to contemplate, because accepting that Pearl Harbor was vulnerable would require admitting that the Pacific Fleet's entire basing strategy was flawed, that the concentration of forces intended to demonstrate American power actually created a magnificent target for an enemy willing to take risks that conventional military thinking deemed irrational. He made one final attempt on December 3, 1941, requesting a meeting with Admiral Kimmel personally to present his analysis without the filtering effect of staff officers who had already decided that warnings from Station Hypo were alarmist nonsense. The meeting was scheduled for December 8th, 5 days away, a time frame that Rochefort knew with sick certainty would be too late because his analysis indicated the attack window was December 6th to 8th, based on the timing of Japanese diplomatic instructions and the coordination required for a carrier strike force to reach launch position undetected. He considered going around official channels, considered releasing his analysis to the press, considered any method that might force defensive preparations, even if it meant destroying his career through insubordination. But military discipline held. The ingrained obedience to chain of command prevented him from taking action that would be seen as disloyalty, even if it might save lives. And so he sat in his basement office on December 6th, 1941, watching the clock and waiting for the catastrophe he had predicted, the catastrophe that senior officers had declared impossible, the catastrophe that was now less than 24 hours away. The morning of December 7th, 1941, began with perfect Hawaii weather, clear skies and light winds and temperature in the mid-70s. Sunday morning when most of the Pacific Fleet was in port, when sailors were sleeping late after Saturday night liberty, when officers were planning golf games and family picnics, when the war that everyone knew was coming seemed distant and manageable, and certainly not imminent, because the intelligence assessments said Japan would attack south, not east, would target the Philippines, not Hawaii, would give some warning before beginning hostilities, because that was how civilized nations conducted warfare, even when they were enemies. Rochefort was in his office at Station Hypo at 0755 hours when the first bombs fell, when the sound of explosions rolled across Pearl Harbor like distant thunder, when the building shook and lights flickered, and someone ran into the dungeon shouting that Japanese planes were attacking, that this wasn't a drill, that the war had started here rather than in the Philippines, that everything the senior officers had believed about Japanese intentions and capabilities was wrong, and everything the ignored cryptanalyst had warned about was happening exactly as he had predicted. He climbed the stairs from the basement to ground level and emerged into chaos, into a scene that would be seared into his memory forever, into the sight of Battleship Row burning, massive warships exploding as their magazines detonated, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could launch, thousands of men dying in the water and in the flames, and in the collapsed wreckage of ships that had been floating fortresses 90 minutes ago, but were now sinking or burning or exploding, while Japanese aircraft circled overhead and selected new targets with the casual precision of men conducting routine training exercises rather than actual combat operations. The attack lasted 110 minutes, 2 waves of Japanese carrier aircraft, 183 planes in the first wave and 170 in the second, striking with coordination that indicated meticulous planning and perfect execution, striking against defenses that were completely unprepared because warning had been dismissed as alarmist speculation, striking against targets that were concentrated and vulnerable exactly as Rochefort had warned they would be if defensive measures weren't implemented immediately. When the attack ended at 0945 hours, when the last Japanese aircraft disappeared to the north and the smoke began clearing enough to assess damage, the casualties were catastrophic beyond anything American forces had experienced in any previous conflict. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans dead, 1,178 wounded, the Pacific Fleet's battle line effectively eliminated as a fighting force, 6 months of offensive capability lost in 90 minutes, because senior officers had ignored warnings from a basement cryptanalyst who understood Japanese communications patterns better than admirals understood Japanese strategic thinking. Rochefort stood in the smoke and watched ships burning and listened to the screams of wounded men being pulled from the water, and felt a rage so intense it made his hands shake, rage at the officers who had dismissed his warnings, rage at the system that valued rank over analysis, rage at himself for not doing more to force defensive preparations, even if it meant destroying his career, rage at the waste of lives that could have been saved if someone with authority had listened to what he had said, had believed what the intelligence indicated, had accepted that sometimes junior officers know things that senior officers don't, that expertise should matter more than seniority, that warnings should be evaluated on evidence rather than dismissed because they conflict with comfortable assumptions. The investigation began immediately, multiple inquiries trying to understand how the attack could have achieved complete surprise, trying to assign responsibility, trying to determine whether negligence or incompetence or deliberate conspiracy had caused the disaster. Rochefort testified before 3 separate boards of inquiry, presented his November reports that had predicted the attack, explained the intelligence indicators that had been ignored, described the responses he had received dismissing his analysis as speculative alarmism. The testimonies from survivors added unbearable weight to these proceedings. Sailors describing how they were eating breakfast in the mess when bombs began falling, describing how they ran to battle stations that weren't manned because it was Sunday morning, and normal peacetime routine didn't include full combat readiness, describing how ammunition lockers were padlocked and couldn't be opened quickly enough to return fire, describing how aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip on Hickam Field and Ford Island, making perfect targets for Japanese strafing runs, describing how the harbor's anti-submarine nets were open because ships were entering and leaving port on weekend schedules, describing how every single defensive measure that might have reduced casualties had been neglected because senior officers believed an attack was impossible. One particularly devastating testimony came from Seaman First Class James Ward, who had been aboard the USS Arizona when the forward magazine exploded, who had been blown off the deck by the blast and somehow survived in the burning water, while 1,100 of his shipmates died within seconds. Ward testified that he had heard officers discussing increased readiness postures in the days before the attack, had heard debates about whether to implement defensive measures, had heard the conclusion that such measures were unnecessary because intelligence doesn't indicate any immediate threat to Pearl Harbor, and because implementing full defensive readiness would create panic and interfere with normal operations. Ward's voice broke during testimony when he described swimming through water covered with burning fuel oil, described hearing men screaming inside the sinking Arizona while he was powerless to help them, described wondering why the ship had been caught unprepared when there had been discussion of warnings, described the bitter realization days later that someone had predicted exactly what happened, but that his warnings had been dismissed because admirals knew better than analysts. The emotional weight of this testimony, the visceral horror of preventable death described by someone who barely survived, made the bureaucratic language of intelligence reports and staff memoranda suddenly concrete, suddenly real in ways that abstracted analysis could never capture. The inquiry boards heard dozens of similar testimonies, each one adding detail to the picture of catastrophic unpreparedness, each one reinforcing the reality that defensive measures could have been implemented but weren't, that warnings had existed but were ignored, that the surprise was organizational rather than tactical, that the failure was leadership rather than intelligence. But the board's conclusions carefully avoided assigning individual blame beyond Admiral Kimmel and General Short, carefully avoided examining the systemic failures that had caused expert analysis to be dismissed by command authority, carefully avoided threatening the broader Navy hierarchy by suggesting that the problem was cultural rather than personal, that the mechanisms which silenced Rochefort remained operational and would silence future analysts who tried to communicate uncomfortable truths to senior officers who preferred comfortable assumptions. The inquiry's conclusions were complex and politically sensitive, acknowledging that intelligence indicators had existed, but arguing that they were ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations, arguing that Rochefort's analysis had been one possibility among many rather than a definitive prediction, arguing that senior commanders had made reasonable decisions based on available information and prevailing assumptions about Japanese strategy, arguing that the surprise was due to Japanese operational security and tactical deception rather than American negligence or ignored warnings. Admiral Kimmel was relieved of command 10 days after the attack, his career destroyed by the disaster that occurred on his watch, his reputation permanently linked to the greatest military intelligence failure in American history. Captain McMorris, who had written the memorandum dismissing Rochefort's analysis, was reassigned to Washington, where he eventually rose to vice admiral rank, his role in ignoring the warnings apparently not considered disqualifying for further advancement. Rochefort remained at Station Hypo, his cryptanalytic operation suddenly valued after being dismissed for months, his expertise suddenly essential after being ignored when it mattered most. He led the team that broke Japanese naval codes before the Battle of Midway 6 months later, providing intelligence that allowed American carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet and achieve a decisive victory that changed the Pacific War's trajectory, intelligence that was believed and acted upon because Pearl Harbor had taught the painful lesson that cryptanalysts sometimes understand strategic reality better than admirals understand strategic theory. In June 1942, Rochefort was recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal for his role in the Midway victory, but the recommendation was blocked by senior officers in Washington who apparently resented his vindication, who perhaps understood that honoring the man who had warned about Pearl Harbor was implicitly criticizing the men who had ignored those warnings. The medal was not approved during the war, was not approved in the decades after the war, was finally awarded in 1986, 44 years after the event and 14 years after Rochefort died, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that came far too late to matter to the man who had been right when everyone with authority had been wrong. Rochefort rarely spoke publicly about Pearl Harbor in the years after the war, rarely discussed his warnings that had been ignored, rarely assigned blame to specific individuals for the disaster that had killed 2,400 Americans and destroyed the Pacific Fleet. But in a 1969 interview conducted by naval historians at the University of Hawaii, asked directly whether the attack could have been prevented if his warnings had been heeded, he said, "Yes, absolutely, without qualification. The intelligence was clear, the analysis was correct, the timeline was accurate. If Admiral Kimmel had dispersed the fleet, if aircraft had been on patrol, if defensive preparations had been implemented, the Japanese would have found an alert force rather than a sleeping target. They might have achieved some damage, but not the catastrophic success they accomplished against an unprepared enemy. 2,400 men died because senior officers believed their assumptions were more reliable than intelligence analysis. That is the simple truth that all the investigations and all the political complexity cannot obscure." Asked why he thought his warnings had been ignored, Rochefort paused for nearly a minute before responding. "Because I was a commander telling admirals they were wrong. Because my evidence was indirect, based on signals analysis rather than direct observation. Because what I was predicting seemed strategically irrational from their perspective. Why would Japan attack Hawaii when Southeast Asia offered better targets? Because accepting my analysis would have required changing their entire defensive posture and admitting that their assumptions about Japanese behavior were fundamentally flawed. Because organizational hierarchies privilege rank over expertise, and in military organizations this tendency is extreme. Because it is easier to dismiss a warning as alarmist speculation than to implement defensive measures that might prove unnecessary. Because human beings, including senior military officers, are very good at believing what they want to believe, and very good at rationalizing away evidence that contradicts their preferences. This analysis, delivered 28 years after the event, with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades thinking about organizational failure and intelligence failures, and the mechanisms by which warnings get ignored, captured the essential tragedy of Pearl Harbor, the tragedy that transcended the tactical details of the attack itself, and reached into fundamental questions about how organizations process threatening information, about how authority interacts with expertise, about how assumptions become so entrenched that contradictory evidence is dismissed rather than integrated, about how the cost of being wrong is borne, not by the decision-makers who ignore warnings, but by the soldiers and sailors who die because of decisions made by officers who were certain they understood strategic reality better than the analysts who actually studied the evidence. The families of the 2,400 Americans who died at Pearl Harbor never knew about Rochefort's warnings, never knew that their loved ones might have survived if senior officers had listened to intelligence analysis rather than trusting their assumptions, never knew that the attack that official narratives described as an unavoidable surprise had actually been predicted with remarkable accuracy by a cryptanalyst whose expertise was dismissed because it came from someone without sufficient rank to challenge admirals' strategic judgments. The official story became that Pearl Harbor was an intelligence failure, that warning signs were missed, that the attack was a bolt from the blue that no one could have foreseen. A narrative that was more comfortable than the truth, that warning signs were not missed, but were actively ignored, that the attack was predicted but the prediction was dismissed, that foresight existed but was rejected by officers who preferred their assumptions to someone else's analysis. This false narrative served institutional purposes, allowed the Navy to acknowledge failure without admitting culpability, allowed senior officers to escape responsibility by portraying the disaster as unavoidable tragedy rather than preventable catastrophe, allowed the organizational hierarchy to remain intact without forcing examination of how rank-based authority had overridden expertise-based analysis with deadly consequences. But the false narrative also meant that the fundamental lesson was not learned, that the mechanisms which had caused Rochefort's warnings to be ignored remained in place, that future intelligence analysts would continue to face the same barriers when trying to communicate threatening information to senior officers who preferred not to hear it. The Pearl Harbor attack became in historical memory a symbol of unpreparedness, a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency, a reminder that surprise attacks happen and that defensive vigilance is essential. These lessons were valid as far as they went, but they missed the deeper truth that Rochefort's experience revealed: that the problem was not lack of intelligence, but rejection of intelligence, not absence of warning but dismissal of warning, not failure to predict but refusal to believe prediction, not organizational incompetence but organizational arrogance that valued rank over evidence and assumptions over analysis. Japanese commanders planning the Pearl Harbor attack understood this organizational weakness, even if they couldn't articulate it explicitly, understood that American forces would be concentrated and unprepared because concentrating forces demonstrated strength and preparing for attack required accepting vulnerability, understood that surprise would be achievable not because secrecy would be perfect, but because warning signs would be rationalized away by officers who believed their strategic assessment was more reliable than intelligence indicators, understood that hierarchical military organizations are particularly vulnerable to surprise because their authority structures make it difficult for junior personnel to challenge senior assumptions, even when evidence clearly indicates those assumptions are wrong. Admiral Yamamoto, who commanded the Japanese combined fleet and planned the Pearl Harbor operation, reportedly said in the weeks after the attack, "We achieved surprise not because we were clever, but because the Americans were stubborn. Their intelligence services detected our preparations. Their analysts understood our intentions, but their commanders refused to believe what their intelligence was telling them because it contradicted their assumptions about what we would do. They expected us to attack south because that was the rational objective. We attacked east because we understood that destroying their fleet was more valuable than capturing resources, and because we knew that surprise at Pearl Harbor was achievable against an enemy who would not believe an attack was coming, even when their own intelligence predicted it." This assessment, if accurately reported, captured the essential dynamic that made Pearl Harbor possible. The dynamic where Japanese operational planning succeeded not primarily through tactical excellence or strategic brilliance, but through exploiting American organizational pathologies, through leveraging the predictable tendency of senior officers to dismiss warnings that conflicted with prevailing assumptions, through understanding that hierarchical military organizations systematically undervalue expertise when it comes from junior personnel, through recognizing that the surest way to achieve surprise was not to hide preparations, but to make preparations that American analysts would detect, but American commanders would rationalize away as impossible or improbable or directed elsewhere. Rochefort understood this dynamic after Pearl Harbor in ways he hadn't fully appreciated before, understood that his warnings had been ignored not because they were unclear or insufficiently supported by evidence, but because they challenged assumptions that senior officers were emotionally and professionally invested in maintaining, understood that organizational hierarchies are designed to resist challenging information from below, because accepting such information requires admitting that junior personnel sometimes understand strategic reality better than senior personnel, an admission that threatens the legitimacy of rank-based authority and creates uncomfortable questions about whether decisions should be made by those with highest rank or by those with best evidence. the institutional lesson that should have been learned from Pearl Harbor, that intelligence analysis should be evaluated on merit rather than dismissed based on the analyst's rank, was partially learned within the Navy's cryptographic services, where Rochefort's vindication at Midway demonstrated the value of listening to expert analysis even when it conflicted with command preferences. But the broader lesson was not learned across the military as a whole, as demonstrated by subsequent intelligence failures throughout the war and in later conflicts where warning signs were dismissed because they came from junior personnel or because they challenged assumptions that senior officers preferred to maintain. The cost of not learning this lesson continued to accumulate in American casualties across multiple wars. In Vietnam, where tactical intelligence about enemy capabilities was routinely dismissed by commanders who preferred optimistic assessments. In Iraq, where intelligence analysts' warnings about absence of weapons of mass destruction were overridden by senior officials who had already decided what they wanted to believe. In Afghanistan, where ground-level assessments of campaign progress were rejected by generals who reported success to civilian leadership, while junior officers reported failure that was more consistent with observable reality. Each of these failures echoed Pearl Harbor, echoed the dynamic where Rochefort's warnings were dismissed, echoed the organizational pathology where evidence-based analysis from subject matter experts is discounted in favor of assumption-based judgments from senior personnel whose rank grants them authority to make decisions even when their understanding of the situation is inferior to that of the analysts they ignore. Each of these failures validated Rochefort's post-war assessment that military hierarchies systematically privilege rank over expertise with predictable and tragic consequences. In 1976, 35 years after Pearl Harbor, Rochefort participated in a symposium at the Naval War College examining intelligence failures and organizational learning. Asked whether he thought modern military organizations had corrected the problems that caused his Pearl Harbor warnings to be ignored, he responded, "No. The fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Intelligence analysts still struggle to communicate threatening assessments to senior officers who prefer not to hear them. The specific mechanisms have evolved. Now there are more formal channels, more documentation, more oversight. But the essential problem persists: that organizational hierarchies create barriers between expertise and authority, that junior personnel who understand specific situations clearly still have difficulty getting senior personnel to accept analysis that challenges prevailing assumptions, that the cost of being wrong is still borne by soldiers and sailors and Marines, rather than by the officers who made decisions based on flawed assumptions rather than expert analysis. This pessimistic assessment proved prescient in subsequent decades when intelligence failures continued occurring with depressing regularity, when warning signs continued being ignored, when experts continued being dismissed by authority figures who preferred comfortable assumptions to uncomfortable evidence. The pattern Rochefort identified in 1941, expertise rejected by authority, warning dismissed by hierarchy, catastrophe enabled by organizational dysfunction, remained operational across military and intelligence establishments, remained a persistent vulnerability in systems designed to privilege rank over analysis, remained a chronic failure mode that generated preventable disasters because the institutional barriers that had caused Rochefort's warnings to be ignored were never actually dismantled despite nominal reforms and despite rhetorical commitment to learning from intelligence failures. Rochefort died in 1976, the year of that Naval War College symposium, having spent 35 years watching his Pearl Harbor experience be repeatedly reenacted in different contexts with different personalities but identical dynamics. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his cryptographic work at Midway, but made no reference to his ignored warnings before Pearl Harbor, as if the greatest intelligence achievement of his career, accurately predicting an attack that killed 2,400 Americans, was less significant than the subsequent success that partially redeemed the organization's failure to listen to him when it mattered most. The memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery included tributes from former colleagues who praised Rochefort's brilliance, his dedication, his crucial role in winning the Pacific War. But none of the speakers mentioned the November 1941 reports. None discussed the warnings that had been dismissed. None acknowledged that 2,400 Americans might have survived if someone with authority had listened to what he said, as if this uncomfortable truth was too painful to address publicly, as if organizational solidarity required maintaining the fiction that Pearl Harbor was unavoidable surprise rather than predicted catastrophe that senior officers chose not to prevent because preventing it would require admitting that a commander could be wrong while a lieutenant commander could be right. The archive that preserved Rochefort's papers included his November 1941 reports predicting the Pearl Harbor attack, included the dismissive responses from Admiral Kimmel's staff, included documentation of his attempts to force defensive preparations, included his testimony before the various boards of inquiry. These documents remained classified for decades after the war, released finally in the 1990s when the participants were dead and the institutional embarrassment had faded sufficiently that historical accuracy could be permitted to emerge without threatening living careers. Historians studying these documents expressed shock, that word appearing repeatedly in scholarly analyses. Shock that the warnings had been so clear and so comprehensive. Shock that the dismissals had been so absolute and so condescending. Shock that the organizational dynamics had been so dysfunctional. Shock that the lessons had apparently not been learned despite the catastrophic cost of ignoring expert analysis. The shock was somewhat naive, reflecting academic unfamiliarity with how military hierarchies actually function, how authority interacts with expertise, how organizational cultures resist information that threatens comfortable assumptions or challenges established power relationships. But perhaps the scholar's shock was justified not because the dynamics were surprising, but because the consequences were so severe and so predictable and so preventable if only someone with authority had listened to someone with expertise, if only Admiral Kimmel had read Rochefort's reports with openness to changing his defensive posture, rather than with determination to find reasons why the warnings could be safely ignored, if only organizational culture had valued analysis over assumption, if only rank had not been treated as proxy for wisdom. If only the 2,400 Americans who died on December 7, 1941, had been protected by officers who believed intelligence assessments rather than dismissed by officers who preferred their own strategic theories. What Rochefort said before Pearl Harbor was clear. Japan is preparing to attack Hawaii in late November or early December. The attack will be carrier-based. The target will be the Pacific Fleet at anchor. The surprise will be complete. The casualties will be catastrophic. Defensive measures are required immediately. What they did with what he said was nothing, because he was a commander and they were admirals, because his evidence was indirect and their assumptions were confident, because accepting his warning would require uncomfortable changes, while dismissing his warning required only comfortable certainty that he must be wrong, because what he predicted seemed strategically irrational. The 2,400 Americans who died paid the price for that dismissal, paid with their lives for the organizational arrogance that valued rank over evidence, paid the ultimate cost because senior officers preferred to be wrong with confidence than to be right with humility, paid because warnings from experts are routinely ignored by authorities who trust their assumptions more than analysts' evidence, paid because that is how hierarchical organizations function when authority becomes disconnected from expertise, and when the people making decisions about risk are not the people who will bear the consequences of being wrong. That is what happened before Pearl Harbor. That is what Rochefort said. That is what they ignored. That is why 2,400 Americans died. And that is why the lesson remains unlearned 70 years later. Because changing organizational culture is harder than acknowledging intelligence failures. Because reforming authority structures is more threatening than accepting blame for specific disasters. Because it is easier to say, "We missed the warning signs," than to say, "We dismissed the expert who read the warning signs correctly because he lacked sufficient rank to challenge our assumptions." Because the truth is too uncomfortable, and the lies are too convenient, and the cost is borne by others rather than by those who make the decisions that lead to preventable catastrophe.